Welcome to Unsilent with your hosts Dave and Brian. This is not another current events podcast. We're digging deeper, diagnosing, and discussing what's really going on today, how we got here, and providing observations for future generations.
Welcome to Unsilent. We're Brian and Dave. We're hoping you'll let us know where you think we got it right and where we totally missed the point, which you can do by visiting unsilentpodcast.com. So, Brian, let's get into it. What are we going to talk about today?
Well, last week, I was asking about, we were talking about how the older people in positions of significant power won't get out of the way. And I'm going to completely contradict myself this week and say, and young people are trying to take over with their kooky ideas. And what's odd, though, is more so than I've ever experienced in my life, we're listening to young people at our own peril. So, for example, going back in, a couple hundred years now to the Salem witch trial era, that was another fourth turning. If you're not sure what fourth turning means, then you can listen to previous episodes or just look up fourth turning. Tons of really cool information on it. And that's kind of the thesis that Dave and I are kind of operating around, that these are cyclical times we go through where there's great upheaval, and we're in the middle of one of those now. So going back to the Salem witch trials, the people who started all that chaos were the young people. Were like, I think they were preteen or 8 or 12, or I don't remember the names and the ages, but the people who started accusing people of being witches were young people, and the adults listened, and the adults put aside all logic and perspective and listen. And now, looking at things we have now, I watched a video. I've seen it a few times now. It's a young man, probably 16, 15, 17, somewhere in there, who is transitioning to become a female. And he's on video going through his first menstrual cramps. Now, and he's agonizing as he's going through these menstrual cramps, and you can kind of see he's smirking, like he's kind of cracking a smile, but he's getting pissed at his parents for not taking him serious, and they're going along with this. Like, oh well, of course you've had a whatever surgery, so now of course you have a uterus, and of course you have menstrual cramps. Like, this is the same kind of lunacy that I'm talking about now. So, Dave, from your perspective, how would you explain to Kenny G in the year 2090 what this is like?
Well, I mean, it certainly is disassociated with reality, if you want to put it that way. And I think one of the things that happens in these periods of time is that, if we all think about our own youth and our own, teens and 20s time frame, we don't have experience. We are finally adults or approaching adulthood, and and now that we know something, even though we don't know much, we know something. We have lots of passion around what we know, what we think we know. And I think what ends up happening is, like with the Salem witch trials, you didn't have, obviously there weren't people flying around on brooms and doing all this kind of stuff, but the young people are so passionate, are so intense about it, and are so intense about here's how it is. We are right. They're wrong. They must be witches. There can't be any other explanation. And the older folks are like, well, okay, they just don't want to fuss with it. They don't want to they hope it's a passing stage. And in most times, in 3 out of the 4 sort of generational cycles that civilization goes through, a lot of things are transitory. With the youth becomes experience, learns that some of the things they're passionate about as youth are not quite as solid and as rock solid as they thought they were, and they grow up.
Fleshed out to be great ideas in the end.
Yeah, they turned out to be not so great ideas. I mean, I can think of plenty of things when I was, and so you're a little bit older. You think, well, that's going to happen with them, but in a time of crisis, in a time of upheaval, then oftentimes that doesn't happen. The passion of the fourth turning cycle of the generation that we're in, of the crisis generation, is such that the passion just takes over, and it drives things a lot further than it would in normal, quote unquote, normal times. And that's what we've seen happen in a lot of situations. It's an extension of that youthful exuberance and with lack of knowledge to the point where very, very bad things can happen.
Yeah, and oddly, it's tied directly to what we talked about last week, which is these very old people who are still in charge,
Right.
who are more driven by spirituality and feelings, and they place a high amount of value on people. Like the term back in the old days was people finding themselves and like those
Right.
kinds of abstract kind of things, and the outcomes that we're looking for are more abstract and ethereal and religious, I guess. Whether, and I don't mean religious like in a Christian, non-Christian way, but religious in that um, you have guiding principles that you're
Right.
adhering to, and that those people being in charge, they're going to listen to people who are saying things that are what you and I would consider to be wrong, because you and I are looking at like, well, what's the math? Like mathematically,
Right.
how's this work? What
Right.
are the real facts that are measurable? That stuff has been pushed aside because what we're after is this more abstract awakening or finding ourselves or reinvention of our spirituality or religion or whatever. And so when these kids come along and they say these crazy things, like, well, how do you know they're wrong? Like the whole point is to find a new way to think about things.
Right. Well, and that's and the way that the youth oftentimes views itself, usually, I think all the time, views itself is, well, we're not going to make the mistakes our parents did. We're our ideas are
Right.
new. And
Yeah.
and the reason, of course, that youth can say that is they haven't had enough time to make mistakes yet.
Yeah.
They haven't had enough time to figure out, well, we really, we might not make the same mistakes our parents did, but we're probably going to make a whole bunch of different mistakes that our parents never made,
Yeah.
and those will be just as bad. And so the sort of the self-deception of youth, and it's not deception, it's just lack of experience, is that we care more. For instance, in this age, the idea is that we care about everybody. We care about the oppressed. We care about the people. And this is where these lines of oppressed versus oppressor come in. We care about the oppressed, and therefore we're going to take drastic, passionate, radical action to right the wrongs that previous generations have done to the oppressed. And
Right.
and the problem is then is when we have, and we've all gone through this, when you have little experience, when you don't have a lot of decades worth of experience, and I'm not bashing youth, I'm just
Yeah.
saying that this is how
Yeah,
I
you
went
probably
through
were
this.
one at one point.
I was one. It was a long time ago, but I was one at one point. And
Yeah.
and the fact is, when you don't have that experience, you can say that I'm pure of mission, I'm pure of heart, and therefore whatever it takes to right this wrong that previous generations have done, this is what I'm going to do. This also translates, if you think about any kind of intensive action in societies, they usually happen with youth. There's that phrase
Yeah.
that old men plan wars and young men fight wars, right?
Right.
It's that concept that we can use the passion of youth. I mean, biologically, physically, when we're young, we have more, youthful hormones and energy in our
Yeah.
body. We're not
Yeah.
worried about so many aches and pains. We think we're invincible. And so therefore you pair invincibility with an era that we're in right now, a crisis era that we're in right now. And the thought is, well, since all of the boundaries are off, and since we know where the wrong is, and there's a singular wrong, we're going to put maximum energy against correcting the singular wrong, and the rest of the stuff we're not even going to worry about because we don't even know about it.
Right. And when you say experience, like young people, like the flaw, and again, I was a young person once too, and so I'm admitting this as a person who was there. The flaw is we don't have experience, and what experience really means is we've not dealt with enough negative consequences from our bad
Right.
choices. Right.
Exactly.
So we're simple creatures. We learn from I stub my toe. I don't want to stub my toe anymore. I'm going to learn not to
Exactly.
do that. We don't learn from I've gone all day not stubbing my toe. I'm going to do more of that. That's not how our brains are
No,
wired. We
that's not how
learn from negative consequences. Right?
exactly.
Okay. So in a situation like now, where the older generation, the elders, the people, the baby boomers, and the people who are in their 70s and 80s are more open to abstract and feelings and things like that than measurable, factual outcomes. When a kid comes along and says something like, "I'm having my first menstrual period because I've quote unquote transitioned," yes, there's the parents who are probably going, this is maybe not okay, but they don't want to have the fight, like you said, or
Right.
maybe they're the types who are like, hey, as long as this is anti whatever my dad said, then yeah, this is awesome.
Right.
And so the kid does not get the negative consequence of somebody saying, what the hell are you talking about?
Right.
You didn't have a surgery where you got ovaries and fallopian tubes, and like this is
Right.
not what happened. You therefore don't have the same cramps as the 16-year-old girl Sally in your classroom. Those negative consequences aren't happening, therefore the experience is not being gained, and therefore we're getting more of this.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is that is what we talked about last time too. The those that are in charge, those that think they've got all the answers and the ideals, think that they can use this youthful exuberance and this, I think one of two things happens. Either if they know it's wrong, if the elders know it's wrong, they might think, okay, we'll just pat them on the head. They'll outgrow it. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
Or number two, they'll say, well, we can use that to further our own agenda, our
Right.
own political, social, agenda. And of course, the problem is that oftentimes that's what happens. But when you're in a crisis era like we're in right now, then you light the match and the fire could get way beyond your ability to control it. And so that's a
Yeah.
very dangerous thing that the elders, the folks we were talking about last week, that's a very dangerous thing that the elders do with the passionate youth, is think that they can control them or think that they'll just go away. I mean, in historical experience, look at China and look at how many in Mao's Cultural Revolution, how many of the kids in the Great Leap Forward, how many of the kids ended up in their passion for their patriotic fervor and their philosophical fervor for the country, ended up turning in their parents and they got killed. Millions and millions got killed.
And I'm going to ask you more about the historical things here in a second. One of the things I want to, before I forget, that I want to explain to Kenny G. And again, for those of you listening, if I don't explain this right, this is a great place for you to go to unsilentpodcast.com or go to our Rumble channel where you can see the video here and post a comment. And if I get this wrong, it's got to be odd for somebody listening to us last week when we just got done railing about Mitch McConnell won't get out of the way and Nancy Pelosi, like they're the ones, like they're holding on to all this power, and that's a problem. And then here a week later, we're talking about, well, yeah, but also it's the kids and their stupid ideas that are going unchecked. That's the problem. And somebody would be listening, going, "What the hell are you talking about? You just got done saying the old people are the problem. Now you're saying the kids are the problem. Like what is this?" And I think that's one of the points I want to make about this moment in time is none of this stuff makes sense, and it's
Yeah.
all overwhelming.
Right.
And there's so many things like this. Like we're on episode 18 and we haven't even scratched the surface yet of all the things we're arguing about as a society. Right. All these things are happening at once, and there's so many moving parts. There's so many things that you're seeing. It's not possible, I don't think, to like put your finger on more than a couple of them.
Right. Well, that indeed, that's exactly right. So and this is, I think, part of the reason people disengage and why things then get worse, because are we capable as a society of addressing a lot of our problems? Yes, we are. But do we do it? I mean, why are there problems today that maybe 30 years ago we could have solved, but today we get zero progress on it all?
Yeah.
Because we're bouncing around like a ping pong ball from crisis to crisis to crisis.
How are race relations worse now than they were 15 years ago? How is
how's it even possible
up from 15 years ago? Like these things, how is border security worse than it was 15 years ago? These things are insane that these things are even So going to the historical stuff, it feels to me, and again, I'm going to ask you because you're like way more into history and understand the stuff better than I do. It feels to me like, imagine you had a problem in your house with a mouse and you said, okay, well, I'm going to I can't get the mouse out of here. I'm gonna go get a snake to eat the mouse, and the snake eats the mouse. But now I have a snake in my house, so now I'm gonna go find a some kind of one of those dragons or whatever to eat the snake. And the dragon eats the snake. Well, but now I have a dragon in my house, so then I have to. And it kind of feels like that is what's happening with these ideas. Is some people who have influence and power are so after crushing people who have opposing views that they do that, but the monster they create to crush the opposing views is bigger than the original problem with the person with the opposing views. Does that kind of feel like what's happening to you?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think part of the challenge with the elders is the elders. When you're young, you can see it very simply, and when you're really old, you can see it very myopically. You can see it through your own lens of history, and that's all. And you can't see,
Yeah.
the permutations that are outside. And so the elders might say, well, yeah, it's youth is just a little bit more exuberant, and we were exuberant youth.
Right.
And I mean,
Yeah.
when they were protesting in the 60s, they weren't protesting for you know anti-biological facts like a man can become a woman and a woman can become a man.
Right.
They were protesting for things that I think a lot of us can agree were good things.
Yeah.
Equal treatment of the races, other things of that nature.
Gender,
And
sexes, religions, like all that stuff. Yeah.
yeah, and so I think, and when you become sort of set in your ways and sort of calcified in your viewpoint of how the world is, when you're ancient like some of our leaders are, then
Yeah.
you tend to view these things that are just so anti-reality that maybe youth might be pushing in their passion and their exuberance. They say, well, this is just like what we experienced back then, not realizing that it's not, and not
Yeah.
realizing that it has the potential. And this is like, again, why I think, we've spent time talking about these generational cycles. In the cycle that we're in right now, there's so many things that are sort of outlandish and really out there that we wouldn't have thought we would be dealing with, that it becomes almost impossible to deal with them all, and to
Right.
and to really try to the elder responsibility is to train and direct the youth to help them put their passion and their energy and their youthful exuberance to good use, to help them with it, not to control
Yeah.
it, but to give them hey, I made all these mistakes, and so if you don't make these mistakes, you'll be better off than I was. Well, that's the responsibility of the eldership. But the eldership, to a great extent, is using it more cynically than that, and is saying,
Yeah.
well, we can use these people, like you said, to get our enemies. And
Yeah.
well,
And I don't think that, to be clear, you tell me if you think I'm getting this part wrong, of course, but I don't think it's a conscious thought.
no,
Like, I think it's, I hated my stepdad, or I hated my grandfather or I hated my own mom who had these values or whatever, and they were foisted upon me, and I'm rebelling against that subconsciously or whatever is going on there. And this group of young people, or this young person in my life comes along who shares in those anti-establishment whatever, I'm going to help them. I'm going to promote those ideas, whether or not they're sound ideas or not doesn't matter, as long as they're not what my stepdad that I hated, they're not his idea. And for the record, I'm not talking about my stepdad. I don't mean I don't mean it like that. But those kinds of authority figures, um as long as it's anti them, it's awesome. But if the idea really sucks, like that's not even a thought. As long as it's anti the person I'm rebelling against, which could be, somebody who had influence over my life, who had traditional values. Is that making sense?
yeah,
It's a
I
subconscious
think
thing, not a conscious thing, right?
no, I think it is I think it's two things. I think it's some of it's subconscious, and I think some of it is just clever marketing. Uh, you know, it, you know,
Right.
I
You
mean,
can't forget people getting paid and all this stuff. That's true.
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is clever marketing, because if you understand that youth are very passionate, if you
Yep.
understand that that's just the nature of being, not youth today, but the youth
Yeah.
of all ages. Youth are very passionate, and if you get that, and that youth don't have the experience to say, just because they haven't been alive long enough to
Yeah.
say that the exercise of these passions in this way will lead to a bad outcome for me and everybody else around me,
Yeah.
then a clever marketer like the Chairman Mao's of the world, or the Hitlers of the world, or any of the people that we might look at in history and say were evil, they can take advantage of that and use that to their benefit. And also the other thing about youth too is you're coming into your own. You're coming into your own while your generation is coming into its own. And
Right.
so there's this desire to go along with everybody in your generation. We're going to change the world. We are going to do it together. And
Yeah.
so the wolf pack mentality, that mentality affects, everybody, but it especially affects us when we're youth. We don't want to be seen as much as bucking the
Yeah.
crowd, because
Yeah.
it's
You do something that the crowd would make fun of you for, and that's a penalty worse than death. I mean, for a
exactly,
13-year-old kid or a 16-year-old kid,
exactly.
like, yeah. So help me, because you understand all this historical stuff way better than I do. What was it? What was the? I've heard the term Hitler Youth. I've heard, is it brown shirts or brown coats? One of the,
Brown shirts they were pretty much young people too, most of them.
okay. So who were the brown shirts? Let's just start with that. Like who were they? Help me understand. Like what was their purpose?
Well, all of them essentially were to, whether it's Hitler Youth. I mean, I've heard the songs of, it's what is it? It's springtime in Germany, and it's these little upbeat songs and rhythms, and they're
I've
talking about
never
how
heard that
wonderful.
before.
Oh,
I'll have to Google it.
it's we listened to it. We're like, what? It's
What?
just like saying Freddy Krueger's here. He's such a nice guy. So, no, I mean, it's it's a real campaign to get everybody on the same page around the societal imperative. And if everybody feels the pain, so if you take a look at Germany, if you take a look at China, if you take a look at a number of these times, there was great shared pain, and
Yep.
then somebody comes along with a positive vision of what could happen, and then it's much easier to get the youth along that ride. So shared slogans, I mean, if you go to rallies, any rally, it doesn't matter when the rally is, you can go to the rallies that are happening right
Yeah.
now. There's simplistic little shared slogans.
Yeah. Or
And
flags or uniforms or shirts or masks in the case of Antifa. Like there's a costume or a symbol of some sort.
right, there's symbols. They all go to belonging. They all go to a
Yeah.
greater purpose. Than and they also go to, we are important. Part of that's, we are important. We're not going to make the same mistakes our parents made. So that fits into
And
that
I
as
think that's
well.
the critical part of this is the mistake our parents made were being duped by the evil Jews in Germany. And who was the, I don't know history well enough to know who was the scapegoat, who was the villain in China.
Well, in China, so they had, it was, what was it, Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists, that, so Japan had the tremendous invasion. I mean, brutal
Yeah.
invasion of
For
China.
centuries they had done that.
Yeah, and it had been awful. And so here's the thing: it almost doesn't matter what the offensive thing has been throughout history. It almost doesn't matter, because it's going to be, we were mistreated,
Yep.
and because we were mistreated
By this group of people, and we're identifying these group of people. There's a villain.
you have to have a villain.
That's a very distinct part of this. Is we were wronged. That's unfair.
Right.
This is the villain, and therefore we are justified to go do our thing.
Yeah, and the other part of that too is, like in China, our parents didn't do anything about this. Our parents were ineffective in doing anything about this.
Or
they were duped. So we're going to take
whatever.
a completely different. We're going to take a completely different path in order to deal with this injustice, whatever this injustice is.
Yeah,
and so
and that's the part I was talking about. Like the subconscious part earlier was, and I think your marketing point is a brilliant one. But this is a subconscious thing to just do the opposite of what our parents or grandparents or whatever.
Right.
It doesn't matter if this new idea is better. It just matters that it's different.
Right. Well, and oftentimes, I think one of the things you could, if you look at sort of how generations align too, oftentimes you'll find a generation not aligning with its parents, but having more affinity for its grandparents. So you kind of have
100%.
and so, because it's like, well, my parents didn't make these mistakes, but grandpa and grandma, I can identify with them more.
Right.
And so, you've got this sort of social dynamic that's there that has a big effect on it as well.
Right. And whether that's accident or part of the creative design of the master designer of our universe and our species and whatever, I don't know. It is a thing though. There's no
Yeah.
question that alternating generations get along better than
Right.
sequential generations or whatever
Yeah.
whatever
Absolutely.
term would be. There's no question about that. And I think that it would have to be that way because your parents have to tell you no a lot. And
Well, absolutely.
grandparents should be the people that get to have the fun stuff. Like they've done their part. Like
Well,
it feels fair to me.
and your parents have the power all of your life, and you
Yeah.
want the power.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I think that's part of it too. It's part of that coming of age and that desire to have the power in society. And then
Yeah.
if somebody comes along and says you can have the power, you just have to
Yeah.
follow me,
Yeah.
then then
And
you have
all you have to do
revolutions.
is this thing that your parents wouldn't like, but your parents were either dumb or evil or misguided or
Yep.
whatever. And all we have to do is vanquish this villain and do these things that your parents wouldn't like, which, you may or may not be okay with that, depending on how much you dislike what your parents were all about.
Right.
And that's not horrible up until the villain is the Jews, for
Right.
example, and we must vanquish all the Jews, for example. Or again, I don't know who the villain was in China. I'm guessing it was more of a classist kind of
Well,
a
yeah.
regime or something like
Yeah,
that in
well, yeah,
China.
you've got the rich people. I mean, it's just like, in France you had the
Yeah,
Maria, let them eat cake. So it's
yeah,
the
yeah,
rich
yeah,
people
yeah.
versus the oppressed masses.
It's always who has the power, right?
Yeah, right,
So there was a power structure in place that they didn't like,
right,
right or wrong, fair or unfair. I'm not criticizing the validity of their point. What I'm saying is the mechanics of how this work are there's a power structure in place they didn't like.
right.
They have a group of people who feel that they're getting the short end of the stick. Quite frankly, in some ways, it can feel that way because when you're young,
Sure.
you have no money, and all
Yeah,
the old people have all the money because they've got 60 years of working behind them,
exactly.
right? And whether again, fair or not fair, I'm not getting to that point. I'm just saying the mechanics of how this work are: you take a group of people who feel like they're being abused, or they don't have the same opportunity. There's a power structure in place where they're at a disadvantage.
Yep,
A villain is established, and then the creative marketing comes in and we say all you gotta do is these things that you have to belong to our club, which they want to do
yep,
anyway, because the
yep,
last thing you want to do when you're 16 is not be in the club.
exactly,
And then we walk you down this path through some clever marketing and slogans and catchy uniforms and flags and whatever, and then we're off to the races.
exactly.
That's kind of the mechanics, right?
Well, that is the mechanics, and it's done in such a way that it sounds like the problem is simple.
Yeah.
Just get rid of the bad guys. You
It
get
is
rid
where
of
the
the
Jews, everything's
Jews.
fine. Yeah, piece of
Yeah,
cake.
we get rid of them, and all of a sudden, because they're the impediment to us. They're standing
Yeah,
in the way of us. So whether it's
yeah,
the rich people or the Jews or whoever it happens to be, they're standing in the way. And it also, the other thing that appeals to youth about that is it's simplistic. Now,
right.
by the very nature of not having a lot of experience in life, you don't necessarily know that a lot of problems are incredibly complex, and a
Yeah.
lot of problems have no real 100% solutions, that you have to deal with
And
shades
people
of gray.
manipulate you and tell you the things for your benefit when it's not for your benefit and it's for their benefit. You haven't
Absolutely.
experienced that yet either. Like people just lie because they want you to do stuff that you wouldn't otherwise do to benefit
Absolutely.
them.
Well, and certainly people will look at folks that look good, that speak well, that speak with
Yeah.
confidence. Well,
Yeah.
this is what's going on, and it's like, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. That is going on. So therefore, everything else they say must be true. And now we march off with the
I
pitchforks
don't
and the
have the
knives.
studies memorized, and I'm going to get this partially wrong, but there is a scientific proof that a salesman who believes passionately in what they're selling has a higher close rate than a salesman who does not believe passionately in what
Absolutely,
they're selling. Because
absolutely.
we, as people who are being sold to, we key on that passion
Yes,
as an indicator of proof, right?
yes, yeah,
And I think that the reason I keep like drilling on like what are the mechanics is because we've talked about on this podcast before. The human experience is either we were wronged by people and therefore we have justification to go do the things we're going to do to them,
right.
or we were born with this inherent superiority, in
Privilege,
which case
yes.
we are what's that?
Privilege, yes.
Privilege, yeah, or just superiority
Yeah.
that whether it's God given or genetically or in our opinions or whatever, we are so superior that we should be allowed to do this thing to these other people. That
Right.
those two storylines are the only stories that are ever told in human history.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing now is the mechanics of how that unfolds with a group of people who are ripe for this. And by the way, there's real problems in the world. Like
Oh yeah.
I'm not suggesting that there aren't serious problems. Like I get that there's real problems. I guess what I'm worried about is looking at how this has happened before and how is today any different. So you had
Right.
the elitists or whatever in pre-communist China, they were the villain. You had the Jews who were the villain. You had the witches who were the villain. You had the English Empire who was the villain. You had slaveholders in the Civil War who was the villain. And now the villain is who, Dave? Who's the villain today?
Well, the villain today is anybody who is in the oppressor class, which is the West, because the West has success. So part of one of the things that that always sort of is an attribute of the villain is the villain has more power or privilege or something perceived than the oppressed person does. So if you look at like Jewish history and conspiracy theories and all of that kind of stuff, there were often times when Jewish folks were very good at banking. Now, why were they very good? I don't know why they're very good at banking. They were just very good at banking. So, but people will look at that, or they will look at.
There was tribes of Native Americans who were really good at working on high-rise buildings without fall protection, and they were imported thousands of miles because they were really good at that. Like, I don't know why.
Sure. Well, and I mean, you can take a look at any group of people and look at just all sorts of you could say, well, Asian folks are really good at math. Why are they really good at math? Well, maybe culturally their parents make them be really good at math. Or,
maybe they study really hard. Yeah, that could be part of it.
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't even really matter why it is the case, but there is a perception that it's unfair. So again, pick your oppressor class or perceived oppressor class and say they have unfair advantage over you. They're no better than you. And see, this is also where we confuse the idea.
Jews in Germany is just a crystal clear example of this because they had fought valiantly in World War I.
Yes,
they had done all the things you would expect a citizen to do, and yet they were to blame for the failure in World War I. They were the blame in the military. The story was that they were stealing people's money because they were in the finance industry and they were manipulating and stealing people. And this is the story that came to be, that they had ruined Germany, not the people who made the dumb decisions to get them into World War I the way they did. The Jews had ruined Germany, and therefore the Jews had to pay.
Right.
And that's why over the last few weeks, I keep coming back to the villain today is people with traditional Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah.
Especially if you're a white heterosexual man.
Oh yeah.
But even if you're a Clarence Thomas who is not a white heterosexual man,
right?
He has very strong traditional Judeo-Christian beliefs, and therefore he is just as much a villain as me and you, maybe more, right? And so we've established who the villain is here. It's people who support or whatever believe in traditional Judeo-Christian values. Now, people might be listening to this and saying, like people today might be listening to this and saying, that's not right, Brian. That's not right. Where do you think that might be off, Dave? Because to me, it's like crystal clear.
Well, I mean, I think it is crystal clear because it's those. There's a direct connection between those values and those belief systems and the success of the West. Yeah. So, if you take a look at Western cultures versus, cultures in, other portions of the world, well, why is it that in the United States, for instance, I think we produce or we create something like 48% of the world's new medical breakthroughs? Well, why is that? We're very small. We're 6% of the world's population. Well, why is that? Well, that's not fair. It must be because, I would propose that it's because the systems that we have set up have proven themselves to be better systems, regardless of who you plug into it, regardless of what races or genders or whatever you plug into it. The system is a better system. But if we say
capitalism,
Yeah,
Yep.
capitalism, free markets,
and
freedom.
and cheap energy, which if you have a belief
Empowered
that
that.
God put you here to multiply and prosper, whatever the terminology was, and the things on the earth were here to serve man, including oil,
Yep.
then cheap energy and capitalism, I would argue, is why I live a lifestyle that is better than every generation prior to me. I would say those are the
Yeah,
two things
I
probably
think
that
that's
would lead to it, right?
undeniable. I think that's
So
undeniable.
two things that are under attack today are cheap energy. We have to have renewable, like whatever, again, as long as it's not the thing my parents had and grandparents had,
Right.
it's good, whether it's really good or not. So we have wind farms and solar farms. And again, I'm not anti wind and solar,
Right.
but there's times where it's not as great. Like it's killing whales and it's killing birds and things are happening that we just ignore.
Yep.
But those are the same things that we use to justify why oil was bad. So we're
Right.
going after cheap energy. We have to have this new way of doing energy, and we're going after capitalism. And
Right.
anybody who supports those are generally people with traditional Judeo-Christian values.
And part of the problem with that is there is a recognition that there's problems, and there are problems. I mean, so
Yeah.
Western culture has not created perfection utopia. Western culture, so the fact that we've been able to, I mean, it's completely undeniable by anybody who has any sense of history and fact that the technical advances and the advances in lifestyle in the West have had their foundation on cheap energy. It's anybody who denies that has no clue about the world.
Yep.
But cheap energy has not created fairness for everybody, has not created a utopia. The same thing's true with capitalism, or what I prefer. I don't like the word capitalism as much as I like the word free markets.
Free markets,
Giving people the freedom to try and to succeed and to fail. And I have tried and I've succeeded and I've failed. I've gone both ends of that spectrum. So I'm not utopia on that either. But so there is the problem that we end up with is then saying that these things have not led to an elimination of racism, because there's still racism. There's still people that don't like other people because of their race. It hasn't led to complete fairness in any space. And so therefore, the problem is then the next problem, and this is where the youth then in particular, get up in arms and get clever rhyming slogans and march on various places, is that because of that, this system must be corrupt, because a non-corrupt system would have led to utopia where it is fair, where everything's fair, where there's no oppressed, where everybody's equal, where everybody's equal outcomes, everybody's got the same amount of money, the whole thing. And this is where then I think the attack on Western culture comes, not from the perspective of, well, there are problems still that exist despite the fact that we've had an incredible success. And what we want to do, because of those problems, is we want to tweak the system. This system, there's no question, if for anybody that has any sense of historical perspective, that Western culture has done, and by culture I mean, our basic system of organizing a society, has done better for human beings everywhere in the world, even those not in the West, has done better for human beings than any other thing that's ever come along. And that's Judeo-Christian. A lot of it comes from the sort of Jerusalem and Greece, if you will. Science and values, etc.
Greece and Rome and Egypt. I mean, all those places had a tremendous amount to build towards what we have now.
Right. And so then, but the idea is not to tweak those things, because it's not it doesn't fuel the passions to say, I want to change the system 5% to be more fair, to be better.
Right.
It tweaks the passions get inflamed when you say, I want to burn the whole thing down and come up with a new fair system. Baby. And these people, these are the poster children for unfairness and for evil and for every bad thing that's happened in the world, regardless of whether they have created a system or not, or they're just living within the system. So those are the falsehoods that are part of this, are part of the sort of the crisis culture that we live in today.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think that specifically for younger, not just young, but younger people, how this manifests itself today, which is wildly different from when I grew up, is one of the things for people with Judeo-Christian values is we have a belief that the world is unfair, but I'm still responsible for well over 80% of my problems.
Right.
Like the problems I have in my life are generally because of me or because I made them worse.
Right.
And that notion has that is almost a a faux pas to even say something like that
Right.
nowadays in
Exactly.
certain places.
Right.
Like that specific thing, like the idea that I'm responsible, even though life is unfair, and we all agree life is unfair. Like
Yep.
I don't have physical or mental abilities of lots of people. I wish I did, and I have privilege over other people. Like there's no question. Like this is
Yeah.
just how it works.
Right.
And I am responsible for well over 80% of the problems, or I make them worse.
Yeah.
That idea, if is just being crushed, and that is so enticing to a young person. Like, well, I've been told by my parents, let's say that I need to do better because I'm the problem, and then somebody comes along and says, "You're not the problem."
Right.
Like the way great granddaddy set up the system, that's the problem.
Right.
Well, if I have a choice of blaming me for my problems or they for my problems, when you're 19, that's a pretty easy
That's a
choice.
very easy choice. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's almost always an easy choice. It's especially easy when you're 19, especially because
Yeah,
you feel like, and it's true, when you're 19 or 20 years old, you've had very little control over what's happened in the world around you,
yeah,
and yet you see problems, and so therefore that notion that the world is fundamentally broken, and I'm new on the scene, and I'm going to take my shot at fixing it, and I'm
yeah.
going to be able to get it done.
And we don't, to your point when we first started talking, we don't have the experience, aka we don't have a history of experiencing the negative consequences
Right.
from going through situations where the thing that sounds really good turns out to be the worst possible thing we could have
Absolutely.
chosen. Eating candy every day sounds really good until you have diabetes and no teeth and you're
Right.
whatever. Like you don't have that when you're young. And so
Right.
of course blaming everyone else is the more preferred path.
Exactly.
But and that's why it's so weird for people like you and I who grew up in a culture where that was not the like American exceptionalism was partly derived from or developed through people figuring that they were the problem and they needed how to figure out how to
Right.
do better or
Right.
be better and be more productive and be a better salesperson or be a better husband or whatever. If I'm having problems, it's my fault. I need to fix it. And that is in large part what we attributed to American exceptionalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now that's going the way of the dodo bird.
Well, and yeah, I remember growing up, and I remember, you saw this flurry of self-help books, Norman Vincent Peale, all this stuff
Yeah.
that came out in the 50s and the 60s. There was this notion, and this, again, the generations, there was this notion after we in the West won World War II that we've done
Yeah.
great things and we will do greater things still. So the primary motivating factor was aspiration,
Yeah.
not destruction. Now, since that time, and a lot of that's happened, and a lot of, we did yoga, we did, Yule Gibbons and eating grape nuts, and we did all these things to
Yeah.
try and get better. But the world's still not perfect. And then
Right.
things started to unwind, things started to unravel, to use the fourth turning terminology. And then we come to a point right now where we look around and we see everything unraveling, and we think the flaw is not within ourselves, the flaw is within the world, and therefore we need to burn down the world and restart it again. Now,
Yeah.
what is likely to happen is, as has happened time and time again, is the world will unravel in a great,
Yep.
phenomenal crisis. Hopefully that will survive, but it will unravel in a great, phenomenal crisis like it has every 80-ish years going back in history.
Yeah.
And then from that, if we overcome the crisis, if we truly overcome the crisis, then we will look back and say we overcame this great crisis. We will be aspirational again, and we'll
Yep.
in some way try to better ourselves and better society. And then in some number of years, Kenny G will look back and say, "Yeah, I remember that when I was a kid."
Yep.
And then things will
Well,
start to
I think
unravel
what part
again.
of what happens is young and old through the process of overcoming the crisis established shared values again.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, shared
I
values
I
and
think that's much because you don't have we wouldn't all be able to agree on what success looks like for our country.
right.
It's kind of implied coming out of the crisis. It was implied coming out of the Revolutionary War. It was implied coming out of the Civil War. Like it was implied coming out of World War II and the Great Depression. It's not like it's nowhere near implied right now.
Well,
There's
yeah, because
there's
it's simple.
no clear vision, no shared vision of what
Right.
success is for a country today.
Well, because coming out of all of those crises, there was one shared vision, and that was survive.
Yeah.
Live.
Right.
Just don't die. So
And
if
you We had to develop new shared values
Right,
through that
exactly.
process.
Well, there's an appeal to that. So if the entire society has a singular shared value, we put all this other stuff aside that we're arguing about. We say, look, all we know is that if we don't all work together, we're all going to die together. We'll all live
Yep.
together. We're all going to die together. Then
Yep.
we'll end up all working together to survive. And if we
Yep.
do survive, we'll say, we all worked together to survive. What can we
Yeah.
all work together to do now?
Yeah.
Well, we'll have that
Hey,
experience.
you're not that bad, even though you're a gasp Jew
Yeah.
or a Christian, or you're not all that bad, turns out. Like,
Right.
hey, I've learned I can like people like you. Wow, what a concept.
We'll have that experience. We'll have a shared
Yeah.
societal experience of overcoming something great, and therefore we'll
Yeah.
set upon the notion from there to achieve greater things. Maybe next time around, assuming we survive the crisis, assuming we all work together, we survive the crisis, and then somebody like a Kennedy will come along and say, we're committing ourselves and our nation and society to achieving interstellar travel within the next 10 years and do the other things
Right.
too. Some
Yeah.
aspirational speech that
Yeah.
really couldn't take place now, but was perfectly set, 12, 15 years after World War II.
Yeah, which would be all the things that 40 years later, all the kids will be talking about what a bastard that guy was and how he ruined everything.
And it rolls around and it rolls
Yep.
around and it rolls around because that's what humans do.
Yeah. I gotta tell you, so you were talking about the self-help stuff that came out in the 50s and 60s. I listened to Earl Nightingale the night before last, I think.
Oh, love Earl Nightingale.
Yeah. And I gotta say, when you and I set out to do this, I never imagined I would see you sing in an episode. I did not predict. So I'm glad we got that under our belt for sure.
Absolutely.
Don't forget, if you're listening and you think these guys are not explaining what this is like right now correctly, please go to unsilentpodcast.com. Check out our Rumble channel and where the videos are posted there. Great place for you to put a comment in. We'd love to hear your perspective. How are we explaining what this moment in time feels like incorrectly, or where do you think we're getting it right? Be great to have some input on helping Kenny G understand, however many 60 years from now, 65 years from now, what this moment was like as they look back. So until next time, this is Dave and Brian signing off.
See you next week.
Do you want to be unsilent? Make your voice heard on our social media channels and share where you think we got it right or wrong. Go to unsilentpodcast.com for social links so you can join the discussion.